Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is the largest game in the Mario Kart franchise by far. Before this game, the standard number of cups was only 8, 4 Nitro and 4 Retro Cups. In the original release of Mario Kart 8, that was the case as well, but over the course of nearly a decade, 16 more cups have been added, bringing us to a grand total of 24 cups. It's pretty safe to say that this game has an enormous amount of content, but is all the content really that good? I'd say overall yes, but with so many cups in the game, some are bound to be worse than others. So today, I thought it'd be fun to rank all 24 cups in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe from the worst to the best. Now how exactly am I going to be ranking these? Well, each cup is made up of 4 tracks, so this will basically be my best estimated average of how much I like each track in a cup. Now I really quickly want to highlight the word estimated here. As some of you may know, I have not ranked all the tracks yet. I do plan on doing that in the future, but I also promised to do an all cup ranking as a remake of my old video before the DLC. Doing this after ranking all the tracks though doesn't make much sense to me, because you could just take all the averages from that ranking to get the cup ranking. So you could think of this video as more of a prediction. Once I get to my all track ranking, we'll revisit this at the end to see how good I did at predicting myself. Since I do plan on making an all track ranking in the future, I'm not going to go as in depth with every individual track in this video, hence why it's not double the length of the original. With that being said, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's jump right into the worst cup. 3 years and 12 cups later, I still ended up having the exact same worst cup. 24, the Banana Cup. In this game, I think there are 4 different types of cups. Nitro are cups filled exclusively with tracks original to Mario Kart 8, Retro Cups, which remake tracks from previous titles, Mario Kart 8 DLC Cups, which is a mix of both, and the Booster Course Cups, which are mostly filled with retro tracks, but the quality is a bit different from the base game one, so I decided to separate them. The Banana Cup falls into the retro category, and the reason I think it deserves last place is just because it doesn't really have a standout track. Almost every cup in this game has one or more really good tracks, but the selection here is just sort of okay. It starts out with the remake of Dry Dry Desert from Double Dash. This is pretty much the most generic desert track you could possibly think of. Aesthetically, there's nothing interesting here, it's pretty much just a desert. This also didn't receive many updates from the original track, pretty much just adding the small oasis to the end. Donut Plains 3 comes from Super Mario Kart, so obviously it's going to be quite basic. I honestly do quite like this remake though. Being able to drive in the water is a very nice change, and tricking up the Monty Moles is fun, but at the end of the day, it's a Super Mario Kart track, so it's nothing special. My favorite track here is Royal Raceway from Mario Kart 64. The glider ramp is a great addition, and this has always been fun to race on. I will never forgive them for walling off Peach's castle. Going there was the best part of the original, why would they remove that? My least favorite track for the cup though has to be DK Jungle from Mario Kart 7. I know this is a controversial take, but I just never really liked racing here. I can't really explain why, but it's just not for me. Far from the worst track in the game, but also not a track I'm ever going out of my way to race on. So yeah, the Banana Cup is just filled with okay tracks. I wouldn't say there's anything terrible here, but the lack of something really great holds this back. 23, the Cherry Cup. This is our first one to come from the Booster Course Pass. It's also the only other cup in the game that I think is even in the running for being the worst. While I would say it has a higher high than the Banana Cup, its lows are so much lower. Kicking off this cup, we have Los Angeles Laps, and I'm just gonna say it, I dislike almost every city track in this game. It seems to be a pretty popular consensus that most of them are extremely boring. There are a few that I do like, which we'll get to when we get there, but a large majority of them are just really boring to me. Let's run through some of the issues I have with them here so I don't have to repeat myself too much throughout the video. While they are all based off different parts of the world, their aesthetics are just far too similar. Normally I wouldn't mind having a few similar aesthetics, but there are 14 of these city tracks, so it got really old. Since these tracks also have to stick to their real world counterparts, many of them just have extremely long and boring straightaways with basically no obstacles. Wow, this is so much fun. So yeah, those are the problems that can apply to almost every city track, and Los Angeles Laps is no exception. The next track in this cup though is somehow even worse, being Sunset Wilds, which genuinely might be the worst track in the game. It was originally a Super Circuit track, meaning its original design is quite basic, but they really didn't change it much here. In a game that got remakes like Cheeseland and Ribbon Road, this sticks out as being really boring. Oh, and you want to know the worst part? They removed this track's entire gimmick. Yeah, in the original, the whole idea was that the sun would set more as the race went on, uniquely changing the background as you race. In this remake though, the track stays exactly the same throughout, so why even remake this track if you're not going to bring over what made it so special? Genuinely one of the most embarrassing remakes in the game. Now with how much I hate this course, you may be asking yourself why this cup isn't in last. Well, that's purely because of our next track, Koopa Cape. This is from Mario Kart Wii and has been a classic for years. Being able to ride through the rushing river and then dive into the water through the pipe is a lot of fun. Genuinely, it's carrying this cup hard. Vancouver Velocity ends off this cup, and if I'm gonna be honest, I think this track is a bit overrated. Now, it is definitely one of the better cities, certainly doesn't help that this cup has 2 of them, but I feel like it stumbles in the same ways as the others. Having anti-gravity is definitely a fantastic addition, but outside of that, the rest of this track is kind of boring. So yeah, the Cherry Cup is not great. Koopa Cape is doing its best to support this thing, but the other 3 tracks are really not helping. 22, the Mushroom Cup. The first Nitro Cup to appear on this list also happens to be the first cup in the game. Now, seeing that it is the first, it does make sense that the tracks here would be a bit more on the generic side. I mean, they're the starter tracks, it's fair enough that it's placing this low. The first track is Mario Kart Stadium, and as first tracks in Mario Karts go, it's one of the better ones. In fact, I'd probably say it's my favorite, as it was tasked with showing off both anti-gravity and the glider, which it does pretty well. Water Park, on the other hand, is one I'm not too fond of. First off, that is the most boring name imaginable. Apparently, the Wa in water is supposed to be like Wario, but shut up, that's stupid. This is supposed to show off underwater driving, and while it does do that well, it's not really the most exciting gimmick out there. A large portion of this track is also dedicated to this big turn, and it's really not that interesting. Running into the Ferris wheel is fun though, I'll give it that. Sweet Sweet Canyon has a really fun aesthetic. Sadly though, I've always found racing here to just be a bit mediocre. Not bad by any means, but this is far from a track I'm excited to play on. Luckily though, this cup ends with the pretty great Thwomp Ruins. I love the ancient aesthetic here, and it brings together the anti-gravity, glider, and underwater gimmicks together in a really satisfying way. The way this track ends with us having to avoid Thwomps plus the little shortcut off to the side is a lot of fun. Of this cup, this track is easily my favorite. So overall, the Mushroom Cup works great for a tutorial, but in turn, that means it's pretty basic. Still though, Thwomp Ruins manages to stand out as being pretty good, so it's definitely a good start to the game. 21, the Boomerang Cup. This is our other booster course cup to come with 2 cities, so it's understandable seeing it this low. Bangkok Rush sure is a track that exists. There is stuff on it that you race through. That is literally all I have to say about this city. Mario Circuit DS, on the other hand, makes me angry. In a vacuum, this track is not that bad. Pretty basic, but there are definitely worse Mario Circuits. But let me put it to you this way. This was the last DS track they ever added to the Booster Course Pass. There are so many other legendary DS tracks that should have been in far before this track was even considered. Aside from Toad's Factory, pretty much my entire list of most wanted tracks come from DS. So what I'm saying is, they should have added Figure 8 Circuit instead. Yeah, so this might be a bit unfair, but I just can't help but dislike this track for being added over stuff like Airship Fortress. Luckily though, Waluigi Stadium from Double Dash is just as fun as ever. It's one of the best looking tracks in the Booster Course Pass as well. I love the new pads attached to the half pipes in this remake too. They did a great job with this track, and it's definitely helping to carry this cup. Singapore Speedway ends this off, and it's actually alright. It still does have many of the same city pitfalls, but it does have a lot of unique elements. Aesthetically, it's also great. I love the colors here, and the song is pretty good too. So overall, the Boomerang Cup is still definitely on the weaker side, but I would say its average quality is on a bit of a rise. 20, the Shell Cup. This was the game's first retro cup, so its choices are a bit more on the generic side. First up is Moo Moo Meadows from Wii, which I have always enjoyed despite it not being crazy unique. The cows are a lot of fun to dodge, and I particularly love the visual update this received from the Wii version. Another similar track is Mario Circuit from Super Circuit. Yes, it is quite generic, but its updates really help it stand out. Just changing that one turn to being anti-gravity completely changes the feel of the whole track for the better. Again, it's another Mario Circuit, so its theming isn't super exciting, but it's just a fun track to race on. Cheap Cheap Beach from DS is a pretty generic beach track, but I'm okay with that because this benefits greatly from the underwater driving changes. Finally, the cup ends off with Toad's Turnpike from Mario Kart 64, and it may be a bit controversial to say, but I think this might actually be my least favorite of the bunch. Now yes, the car gimmick is really cool, I have a lot of fun trying not to run into them. Thing is though, the cars used to be way harder to avoid in the original, which I thought was more fun. I do like how you can drive on the walls and a few cars here, but at the same time, those also just make the track a bit easier. Sometimes you can even go for long stretches of time without any cars in front of you, and now I'm just getting flashbacks to the Tour City tracks. Well, I guess it would be a flash forward because this came out for whatever. The Shell Cup's tracks are all just pretty solid. No full-on stinkers here, but it's held back by the lack of a true highlight. 19, the Golden Dash Cup. This was the very first cup of the Booster Course Pass. Now, like the other first cups we've seen so far, this is generally worse than what came after it, but for a completely different reason. When the Booster Course Pass first came out, I mean, they just didn't try. The graphics in the first wave especially are super weak when compared to the later waves, which makes these tracks look a lot worse in comparison. Paris Promenade starts this cup, and I actually don't dislike this one too much. It might just be because it was the first city, but I actually kind of like the layout. It's definitely on the simpler side, but it's still got a good amount to like. I especially enjoy how after the glider, you have the choice to take a faster path to the left or get an item box on a slightly slower route. Toad's Circuit on the other hand is awful. It is one of the very few remakes that I can confidently say is worse than the original, but it's for a different reason than the others. This basically got no layout changes at all, meaning the only real change was the graphics. how did they make this look worse than it did on the 3DS? On top of that, the layout itself is just very boring, which makes the decision to include it as DLC at all very frustrating. Luckily, this cup picks up with the Choco Mountain remake. This got a lot of great changes from its Mario Kart 64 version, with not only expanding on the cave section, but also adding in a glider ramp. To this day, it's still one of my favorite Booster Course Pass editions, which is surprising because I wasn't too big of a fan of the original. Coconut Mall, on the other hand, took a bit of a hit. This is still one of the series' best, but it definitely lost a bit when coming over here. Not only is it now much more obvious which escalator to take, but when this track first released, the cars at the end just didn't move. This was so bad that it actually had to be changed in an update, which is pretty surprising, but even then, the cars only now do donuts, and I feel like the original approach was still better. The mall theming and general layout here is still fantastic, so I can't call this a bad track by any means, but it's definitely a weak remake. So overall, the Golden Dash Cup has a great track in the form of Choco Mountain, 2 solid tracks in Paris Promenade and Coconut Mall, and it has Toad Circuit. 18, the Leaf Cup. I have a feeling this ranking will be somewhat controversial, as there are 2 tracks that I hear people generally really like, but I only think they're okay. The first of them is what kicks this off with Wario Stadium from Mario Kart DS. I've always just been more of a Waluigi Stadium fan myself. This track did get a few new additions like an anti-gravity and water segment, so I would say this is a good remake, but I've never really loved racing on this. I can't say I dislike it either though, it's just got nothing that really stands out to me as being a highlight. Sherbert Land from Double Dash is in a similar boat, but I think it's much less controversial to think this one's a bit generic. Also, I'm just now realizing there are 2 different tracks called Sherbert Land in the Mario Kart franchise. Similar to Dry Dry Desert, this is just about the most generic execution of a theme you could think of, this time being an ice track rather than a desert. The new underwater pathways are nice, but aside from that, this track has a lot of empty space. Now, the real hot take comes with Music Park. I think this track is just okay. Listen, I love the theme here a lot, having us race on several different musical instruments, but I just don't find actually racing here all that exciting. I'd probably say it's in the top half of the game's tracks, but that's mostly due to aesthetic rather than layout. A track with a great layout though is Yoshi Valley from Mario Kart 64, easily my favorite track of this cup. Its gimmick is that there are just a billion different routes you can take here, and while yes, the left path is definitely the only one you should ever take, I still just love this idea. There are a lot of great set pieces here too, like the super skinny bridge that acts as a dangerous shortcut, or that stupid egg that always ruins my day. I also just love the song here, it's perfectly goofy. The Leaf Cup is once again another one that has no bad tracks. While I definitely wouldn't go out of my way to pick the first 3, I wouldn't complain if I got them online. Yoshi Valley also being here really helps out this cup to being an overall solid choice. 17, the Flower Cup. It's been a little bit since we've encountered a Nitro Cup, and I guess it makes sense to just continue down the list with the second one. I honestly think this choice might be controversial, but for the opposite reason my last one was, as I think the first track, Mario Circuit, is very underrated. It shows off the anti-gravity gimmick in a really cool way, as the entire track is placed on a Mobius strip, meaning you drive on both sides. There are also a ton of turns that work great with the purple spark mechanic. This also has by far my favorite Mario Circuit music piece in the entire series, so I think this might just be my favorite Mario Circuit of the bunch. Toad Harbor is another course I'm a fan of. There are several alternate paths, whether it be going onto the boats, riding up on the roofs, to even riding on the walls. Heck, you can even cross the finish line by going on the train tracks instead of the main road, which I always do if it's open. The trains are also just a great obstacle that adds so much to this already solid track. We do take a bit of a quality dip though with Twisted Mansion, but even then, it's not that much. It does a great job with its ghost house theming, having a lot of spooky obstacles to avoid. The addition of the underwater segment was also a fun touch, making this my second favorite water-based ghost track in the game. The only reason I don't love this track is because, well, I don't know honestly, I guess I just like other tracks more. Tracks like Shy Guy Falls, which is definitely my favorite here. Using anti-gravity to go up and down waterfalls was such a creative idea, and I think they executed it perfectly. I also just love the general aesthetic of this track. The song and setting go super well together. We're really starting to see a rise in quality with the Flower Cup here. It's got 2 very solid tracks, 1 fantastic track, and only 1 that I just thought was sort of okay. 16, the Bell Cup. Ranking this one sucked. If I were to describe this cup as simply as possible, I'd show you this image. Now this is one of the few cups to actually change between this and my original ranking, as I originally put it below the Leaf Cup. I'm honestly still not sure what to feel about this, so let's just go through the tracks. This is our first Mario Kart 8 DLC cup, meaning it's a mix of both retros and originals. First we have Neo Bowser City from Mario Kart 7, one of my least favorite tracks in the game. Now this track is extremely controversial, being pretty much a 50-50 split between loving it or hating it. I personally can't stand it though, it's just not fun fun to drive on as there's really nothing interesting. The slippery controls from the rain do not help with that either. The aesthetic has also just never been one I'm a fan of, so I have basically nothing to like about this track. On the other hand though, Ribbon Road is one of the best remakes in the game. This comes from Super Circuit, but it changed so much in 8 Deluxe that it would basically be impossible to tell. I have a whole video about this and another Super Circuit track we'll see later, but in short, the aesthetic is better, the added shortcuts are fantastic, the wavy road is perfect, the glider section with the clown cars is awesome, and there's just so much more. Genuinely one of the best tracks in the franchise. And then there's Super Bell Subway. I just think this one's mid. The trains are kinda cool to dodge, but I'm never really excited to see this one pop up. But then Big Blue comes in to save the day. This is not only our first crossover track being based on F-Zero, but also the first track to be split into sections rather than laps. Like Ribbon Road, I also have a video on this going into more detail, but the sections here all feel super distinct, making this feel like an adventure. Plus the shortcut where you can essentially hover over a good portion of section 2 is always really fun. So yeah, the Bell Cup has extremely low lows, but also very high highs. In the end though, this ranking is about consistency, and I feel like the way this balances out means it has to place on the lower end here. 15, the Lucky Cat Cup. I guess this is pretty fitting to follow up the Bell Cup, and just like it, it's another one with a severe quality split. It starts off with Tokyo Blur, the worst and most boring city track by far, but it picks back up with Shroom Ridge. Now on the DS, this track never really stood out to me, but here I actually love this track a lot. It uses the cars much better than Toad's Turnpike did, as the road is both skinnier and has a cliff at the side at certain points. The road is also much more windy, meaning crashes happen way more often. This also just has one of my favorite songs in the game, so this was a surprise hit for me. Sky Garden makes me angry. If you ignore that this is a retro track, then it's fine. It'd basically just be a worse Cloud Top Cruise, but there's really nothing wrong with that. As a remake of Sky Garden though, this is atrocious. It barely resembles the original track at all, and this was basically the one Super Circuit track that had a great layout while only being in 2D. Many of the track's shortcuts that made it so fun in the first place are gone, and the aesthetic just doesn't have the same vibe. The one positive I can really say about this is that the music is fantastic. But yeah, this is among one of the worst remakes due to it changing so much of this track for the worse. But luckily this cup ends with the best track we've seen so far with Ninja Hideaway. This is the first to our original track not based on a city, and they did a great job. There are so many different paths you can take, and the layout is legitimately very difficult to navigate. Aesthetically it's phenomenal, and there's just so much content here. So the Lucky Cat Cup, when compared to the Bell Cup, has higher highs, and I'd also say its lows aren't as bad as the Bell Cups, which is why I think it can edge it out here on the list. 14, the Spiny Cup. Oh boy, another cup that's half mid and half great. This was the final cup added in the entire game, and while I am a little disappointed to see it placing so low, I think it still worked as a decent conclusion. This cup starts off with Madrid Drive, and wow, another basic city. I will say I kinda slandered the music in my last video because after listening to it more I think it is pretty solid, but other than that, I have nothing else to say here. Rosalina's Ice World is boring. You know how I said Sherbert was generic? Well, this is probably just as bad. No amount of Mario Galaxy references can save this track, especially since I don't really like Mario Galaxy. But now the tracks actually pick up with the phenomenal Bowser's Castle 3 remake. This was originally an SNES track, but it got a ton of changes like anti-gravity and just a general aesthetic makeover. It is a bit sad that this is the only Retro's Bowser Castle to get added, but they did a great job with it, so I'm not too mad. The best track is definitely what we end off with though, being Wii Rainbow Road, one of the best courses in the series. This keeps its difficulty intact while even adding on a few more other features like anti-gravity. Plus, this just being in a game with 200cc makes it even more exciting. So yeah, I really wish the Spiny Cup was a bit more consistent, but those last two tracks were a great way to wrap up this game. 13, the Turnip Cup. Starting off with New York Minute, it's another city. It doesn't really have any long straightaways, but it doesn't have anything special about it either. Next up is Luckily, Calamari Desert from Mario Kart 64 is phenomenal. It was already one of the best tracks in that game, but this also got some very interesting changes. Now the route will actually update each lap, so on lap 2, you actually get to ride alongside the train through the tunnel. This is such a cool way to change up this track. I was super excited when I first raced through here, and it remains as one of my favorite remakes. But even with that fantastic remake, it does not compare to Waluigi Pinball, one of the best tracks in the series. Aesthetically, this does not disappoint, being one of the best looking tracks in the entire DLC. It's still just as fun to race alongside the pinballs, and getting to do it with 12 racers instead of just 8 really adds to the chaos. The only negative I have about this is that I am really annoyed it didn't get a new remix. It shares a song with Wario Stadium, making this the only track of the entire game to not have an original piece. The song still sounds really good of course, but getting a new remix would have been nice. So just like our last few cups, the Turnip Cup is one with some fantastic tracks, but just fails a bit when it comes to consistency. 12, the Moon Cup. You guys are not gonna believe this, it's another split cup. I guess that's kind of just a symptom of of all the Booster Course Cups coming with at least one city. Speaking of, we got Berlin Byways. It's got cars on it, which makes it slightly more interesting than your average city, but it's still not one I'm ever going out of my way to pick. Peach Gardens from Mario Kart DS, on the other hand, has always been one of my favorites, and the remake here actually surprised me quite a bit. First off, it kept the aesthetic intact, so driving through the flowers and hedge mazes here is just as fun as ever. However, they also made it so that the last lap you actually go through the course backwards, making this one of the very few remakes to change route based on the lap. It was a super cool change of pace, and this is definitely one of the Booster Course Pass tracks I've replayed the most. They even added a glider ramp at the backwards part so you can high-five Luigi. Seriously, what more could you possibly want? Merry Mountain, though, is kinda mixed for me. I think it starts pretty great, I love the Christmas aesthetic, and they have a few alternate paths you can take, but now it's time to be a Grinch. The ending of this track sucks. It's just a super long straightaway with zero obstacles. It takes up a large portion of the track, and it honestly ruins it for me. I mean, it's still alright, but man, I wish this ending was better. Luckily, the ending for the cup is far from being weak, as it's 3DS Rainbow Road, and it's my personal favorite Rainbow Road in the game. Not only do I think it looks the best, but it being separated into sections makes it very distinct. Not only do you ride on the Rainbow Road itself, but also a few planetary rings and even the moon. Everything about this track is perfect, and I think it really helps this cup out a lot. The Moon Cup definitely has the best track we've seen so far, but sadly it's still got two somewhat weak ones with Berlin and Merry Mountain. Overall though, this split is not as bad as our last few cups, so I think it fits pretty well here. 11. The Propeller Cup. Guys, I think we're finally free from the split cups. That's all because I actually quite like the city track this time around being Sydney Sprint. Not only is the music here easily the best of the cities, but the layout is pretty fun too. It's still not a standout track by any means, but getting a city that I actually wouldn't mind racing on is very rare. Next up is Snowland from Super Circuit, and this definitely got a glow up. Not only is the added verticality to this track a great addition, but the penguins also just act as really fun obstacles. Okay, the real reason this is better is because it doesn't have the screen shake. Seriously, why did the original shake like this? It's so annoying. Mushroom Gorge from Mario Kart Wii also makes a return here, and it's just as fun to bounce on the mushrooms as ever. The glider mushroom from the Mario Kart 7 version making a return was also nice to see. My favorite part about this though is 100% the gap jump. It's one of the trickiest cuts in 8 Deluxe, but you save so much time if you land it that it's almost always worth going for. That time save makes it so much more satisfying when you land it, meaning this is probably one of my favorite shortcuts in the game. Sadly, I cannot say Sky High Sundae is my favorite of anything. It's another tour original, but it's just not fun to race on. Unlike the other tracks that have water physics, it feels really out of place here. On top of that, the camera just breaks sometimes, not letting you see where you're going after this jump. The aesthetic too just doesn't look good. But yeah, instead of having two stinkers, the first 3 tracks in the Propeller Cup range from solid to fantastic. Sky High Sundae does drag it down, but the average is definitely starting to pick up. 10. The Rock Cup. London Loop is boring. It's got absolutely nothing notable and just feels about as generic as a city can get. So moving past it, we got Boo Lake from Super Circuit, which got one of the best remakes in this DLC. A large portion of this track now takes place in anti-gravity, but more importantly, they actually added a lake here, having the last half of this track take place underneath it. This one is always just a blast to race on, and since this remake executed its theme so much better than the original, it gets to be my favorite underwater ghost track in this game. Yippee! The next track is Rock Mountain from Mario Kart 7, also known as Alpine Pass, which I think is a way worse name. This one is just pretty solid. It uses the glider incredibly well, having us fall down the mountain and even glide across a cliff. Not my favorite track in the world, but one I'm always happy to play on. Maple Treeway from Wii ends off this cup, and it's iconic for a reason. It's very good. I always love fall aesthetic, so I was already biased to like this one, but the concept of riding through the trees is extremely well executed. So yeah, I think this cup rocks. Oh, come on, that was funny. 9. The Acorn Cup. This is our first cup in a while to have no stinkers. Rome Avanti, despite being another city, is actually quite good as it implements the Colosseum into the track. That not only makes its layout more interesting, but its aesthetic as well. Even the city portion itself has a few enemies to stop it from being boring, which is something that I can't really say about most of the cities. DK Mountain from Double Dash follows this up, and it's always been a track with a really cool idea. You start the race at the bottom of the mountain and then get shot up to the top, so the rest of the race follows you back down to the bottom. The turns in this track are super twisty, making it difficult to stay on sometimes. Sadly, Daisy Circuit is sort of generic, but it's definitely not bad. The Daisy and Luigi statues make it stand out visually, and the glider shortcut has always been fun to take. The tour original track for this cup, Piranha Plant Cove, was also really cool. It takes a unique approach with its underwater gimmick as it plays around with verticality far more than any other water track we've seen. That means you can actually cut quite a few corners by holding back in just the right way as you enter the water, which I think makes this track much more fun. This also changes the route each lap, being the only tour original to do so. There are a few stretches of track with minimal content, but overall overall, I really enjoyed this one. Seeing as the Acorn Cup came with the last wave of DLC, I thought this made the final wave feel pretty strong. 8. The Special Cup. The Special Cup starts off with Cloud Top Cruise. Man, I'm so happy to not be saying a city right now. This is a track that I've always loved. The cloud aesthetic is done super well here. Going from the bright white clouds to an airship only to be shot into some thunder clouds is always super cool. Dodging the lightning in this stormy section is also intense. Managing to snag a boost panel right before a strike feels so good. Sadly, Bone Dry Dunes is a bit of a disappointment. I know that might be a bit weird coming from the Dry Bones guy, but yeah, this track is a bit boring. I will say though, it has grown on me a little bit, mostly because I think a lot of the cities are way worse, but hey, that's something. Bowser's Castle at least picks us back up, and I love this. It's my personal favorite Bowser's Castle in the series. Not only does it visually look phenomenal, but the obstacles here are fantastic. So much fire, spike balls, and of course the giant Bowser statue punching the road you drive on. It's so good that even if they didn't add Bowser's Castle 3 as DLC, I'd say my Bowser's Castle itch for this game would have been more than satisfied. Unfortunately, Mario Kart 8 Rainbow Road is extremely controversial. The idea behind it being in a space station is certainly unique, but yeah, I kind of like the more mysterious and magical approach from the others. This is my least favorite Rainbow Road in this game, but with that being said, I still think it's a very solid course. It's quite difficult, so it's very easy to fall off here. The split road at the end is also a great addition because you're able to jump between them, making the race far more interesting. I think my opinions on the Special Cup as a whole have just risen over time. I love Cloud Top Cruise and Bowser's Castle just as much as ever, and honestly, Bone Dry Dunes and Rainbow Road have been growing on me as well, which is why I think it deserves to be up here. 7. The Triforce Cup. We've reached the first of 2 cups branded after their crossover track, and I think they are both phenomenal. This starts out with Wario's Gold Mine from Mario Kart Wii. This aesthetic is very unique, and I love how anti-gravity was used to make the rails even more interesting to drive on. This is always a great one to race through. SNES Rainbow Road is— what are you doing as the second track? Yeah, this Rainbow Road not finishing the cup will always be weird to me. I get it's because these mixed cups all started with the retros before moving on to the nitros, but I kinda think an exception could have been made here. Anyway, this is a great track. While it's still mostly flat, the thwomps causing the road to wave around is a nice touch. Plus, I've always just really liked how this Rainbow Road looked. Like Mario Kart Wii's, and honestly all the Rainbow Roads, this just existing in a game with 200cc is also a significant enough addition as it makes it so much harder. Ice Ice Outpost has one of the most unique layouts and aesthetics for an ice track. The entire thing is split on a yellow and green road, meaning there are many ways to go about racing here. On top of that, this track has 3 different shortcuts that are both difficult and don't require a mushroom. That means you could take them no matter what item you have, but due to their difficulty, it can be very scary to actually take the risk. And of course, this cup ends off with Hyrule Circuit, being based on the Legend of Zelda series. There are so many neat little references, like the coins being replaced by rupees and the piranha plants being replaced by Deku Babas. My favorite part is definitely inside the castle though, where a ramp will appear if you activate all 3 switches on the stairs. It's such a perfect way to implement the puzzle element of the franchise. I do think this track could have benefited from exploring more locations, possibly even being a segment-based track, but in the end, I still really liked it. All 4 of the tracks in this cup are really fun. None of them are my absolute favorites, but the consistency here is very high. 6. The Feather Cup. Alright, time to go back to the Booster Course Pass. This cup starts off with easily my favorite city of the bunch, Athens Dash. Aesthetically, this looks very different from any of the others, but most importantly, it's got the most interesting layout. There are a ton of massive jumps, interesting obstacles, and more that make this track stand out. It feels like it can stand alongside the rest of the game's tracks, which is very high praise for a city. Daisy Cruiser from Double Dash is also a fun one. Taking place on a cruise ship, I love all the locations here, having us drive through a pool, a dining area, and even a secret underwater section. Moonview Highway from Mario Kart Wii, similar to Shroom Ridge, is one that I was very surprised to like as much as I did. While I don't like Moonview Highway as much as that, this still builds an interesting track around the car gimmick. I also love the addition of the bomb cars here since none of the other car-centered tracks have them. There are also some pretty interesting hidden routes here that I feel add quite a bit. But the best track in this cup by far is Squeaky Clean Sprint. This takes place in a giant bathroom and is one of the most imaginative tracks in the series. Going through the bathtub, flying over the toilets, driving on the shelves, all of it was done perfectly. This is genuinely one of the best tracks in the series. I can't tell if I like this or Ninja Hideaway better. The Feather Cup continues on with having no bad tracks, but this time it's got a pretty distinct standout with Squeaky Clean Sprint. We're really starting to get into the good stuff now. 5. The Egg Cup. Interestingly, of the Mario Kart 8 DLC cups, this is the only one to have a single retro track instead of 2 like the others. I'm not complaining though, because the one retro track this did get was Yoshi's Circuit from Double Dash. This is easily the best circuit track in the series, and it's hard to even know where to start here. It's got one of my favorite shortcuts in the game with this cut through a waterfall, which always starts this race off with a bang. I also like jumping over these patches of grass that have the piranha plants. But of course, the main reason this track is so iconic is because it's actually in the shape of a birdo. Wait, no, that's not right. The song here is also fantastic. I genuinely think this is a near perfect track. Following it up is Excitebike Arena, which I know is a bit controversial, but I'm personally a big fan of it. It's essentially a giant oval filled with several ramps, but what's cool is that the ramps actually randomize every time you play. You can get some serious air off of these, and I really feel like this is just a pure fun track. Plus, it being a crossover with Excitebike is pretty neat. Sadly, Dragon Driftway is not my favorite. I know a lot of people like this one, but I just can't get into it. I guess the sort of wavy turns can be kinda cool, but I don't know, I've always been more negative toward this one. Mute City on the other hand is a lot of fun. This is the second F-Zero track, and while I definitely like Big Blue more, this isn't bad. This is filled with a ton of boost panels that make this feel super high speed, exactly like its source material. So while Dragon Driftway was a bit weak, the two crossover tracks on top of Yoshi's Circuit make the Egg Cup a fantastic choice. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that there were 4 different types of cups. I didn't intend for this to happen, but our top 4 each come from a different category. So for the best cup of the Booster Course Pass, we have 4, the Fruit Cup. The reason this is the worst of the best is solely because it's the only one to have a boring track. Luckily, we can get that out of the way first. Amsterdam Drift is one of the most forgettable city tracks. Nothing interesting to say here. Riverside Park from Super Circuit though is very solid. This remake essentially adds a new gimmick to the track, being these piranha plants that have items in place of a patooey. On top of that, they also have you ride inside a mountain and jump through a waterfall at the end. Definitely love what they did here. But now this cup gets really good with DK Summit from Wii. This has always been a fan favorite. It follows a very similar format to DK Mountain, launching us up to the top and then tasking us with riding back down. This track is filled with places to trick on, whether it be ramps, bumps, or half pipes. This track also has a gap jump much like Mushroom Gorge, so this one might even be scarier because if you miss, you fall for a long time. Now in most other cups, this would be the peak, but the Fruit Cup ends with Yoshi's Island. I am very confident to say that this is the best tour original track by far. It technically acts as a crossover since it's based on the Yoshi's Island games, and they go all out with it. Not only do the coins now have Yoshi's face, but there is just so much on this track from the franchise that it would be impossible to name them all. There's also such a large variety of locations here, despite this being a standard lap track and not split into sections. This took pretty much everyone by surprise, and most agree that it's one of the best tracks in the series. So yeah, while it does have Amsterdam Drift dragging it down, the Fruit Cup having both DK Summit and Yoshi's Island is kinda crazy. If this had gotten something like Athens Dash as its first track, this might have been the best cup in the game. As for the best Mario Kart 8 DLC cup, we have 3, the Crossing Cup. Right out of the gate, we start with a banger with Double Dash Baby Park. Yes, it's just an oval, but it's an awesome oval. This is the only track in the game to not have 3, but 7 laps, and with double items and 12 racers, this is one of the most chaotic tracks in the franchise. Yes, it's simple, but playing on this one is just pure fun. It's one of my favorites in the game. Speaking of favorites, Cheeseland is another one of them. This is from Super Circuit, and just like Ribbon Road, this got a massive makeover. Not only does it play into the cheese theme more this time by having cheese holes to trick on and a cheese you could take a shortcut through, but the layout received a huge overhaul. A majority of the track is now in anti-gravity, and there are also a few gliders in the off-road that skip major portions of the track, making the ending super intense as you never know when someone might catch up. And then we got Wild Woods, and while it's not my personal favorite, I still really like this one. It takes place inside a massive tree, which we've never really seen before. This is a very popular track, and I think it's fair to see why. But of course, the cup ends with Animal Crossing. It's one of the most unique tracks as it actually has 4 variations, one for each season. Not only do these change the track visually, but several obstacles change between them as well. It makes playing on this track multiple times more fun, and the seasonal gimmick of course fits with Animal Crossing as a series. There are no shortages of references to it as well, with the coins now being bells, Rossetti appearing, this rock giving you money if you run into it, and so much more. So yeah, the Crossing Cup had some bangers. None of these tracks are bad. The worst is Wild Woods, and even then, that's a great track. This definitely deserves to be high up on the list. And the best retro cup in the game is 2, the Lightning Cup. Just like our last one, this is non-stop bangers. We start with DS Tick-Tock Clock, which has always been one of my favorites, and it got a huge makeover. Not only are there now glider ramps, but the hands on the track's clocks now act as shortcuts rather than obstacles, and they're some of the hardest shortcuts at that. And of course it goes without saying, being based on a clock is so unique from anything else we've seen in the series. Following this is 7's Piranha Plant Slide, which is based on a classic underground setting from Super Mario Bros. It's shocking this theme hasn't been done before, but they execute it perfectly here. There are several piranha plants, Goombas, and pipes, all stuff you'd expect to see here. This also has an anti-gravity section which takes place underwater. Going back to the original version of this track after seeing this feels so wrong and claustrophobic. The ending of this track is great too, having a really neat shortcut through this cardboard bush cutout. Hey, but why stop the bangers there? Grumble Volcano from Wii is another absolute classic. This is filled with lava and fire, making it a super intense drive. What's really cool is that every lap, this track falls apart more and more, making each lap get harder and harder. The added glider ramps are also fantastic to throw on here. Shoutouts to Lakitu for running into this wall. But of course, this cup ends with N64 Rainbow Road, the cover game for 8 Deluxe. Obviously that shows just how good this track looks, but the layout is so much better here than the 64 version. Anti-gravity made this so much more interesting to ride on, plus the wavy road, bouncing chain chomps, and glider add even more to it. They also fixed the biggest problem with the original by making this a section track rather than a lap track. I know some people do miss the old version, but that thing took like 6 minutes. So yeah, all 4 bangers once again. The improvements to these retro tracks made them each so much better, and most of them were already fantastic to begin with. I think the Lightning Cup absolutely earned its spot as the runner-up in the game. But my absolute favorite cup in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is the Star Cup. Wow, it's almost like I made a video about that. Yeah, so my number 1 remains unchanged, which is not too surprising because it's just filled with so many great tracks. Sunshine Airport is a really good idea for a course, taking place in and outside of an airport. I especially love how you basically become the plane and fly up into the sky. There are even several luggage conveyors here too, which just adds to the track's theme even more. The next track is Dolphin Shoals, and while it is easily the weakest, it's definitely still pretty solid. It takes place mostly underwater, which faces us with several unique set pieces like pipes blowing air, and we even get to ride on an eel's back. Following that, we burst out of the water, which is super memorable because that's when this track's fantastic song fully kicks in. But speaking of music, it's time we get to Electrodrome. This is one of the most fun settings in any track, taking place in a massive disco. Everything about this is so colorful and fun to race through. Even the piranha plants bob their head to the music. What's not to love about this track? It's easily one of the best in the game, but if you want to see the best in the game, look no further than Mount Wario. This track is an absolute masterpiece. It's another course that's split into sections, and it uses this gimmick the best out of any track. You start by jumping out of a helicopter and riding down the icy mountain. Then you enter into a cave, which brings you onto the side of a dam. Following that, you go into a forest, and then you finally go on a massive ride down the snow to the end. This track, more than any other, feels like an adventure, and there's just so much to each of these sections that I don't even have the time to fully run through. So yeah, for having not only my favorite track in the game, but 3 other very strong contenders, the Star Cup gets to remain as the best cup in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. But anyways, that's it for this video. Do you think London Loop is actually the peak of track design and you hate me for calling it boring? Let me know in the comments. I hope you all look forward to my all-track ranking in the future. It's probably a while away since it'll obviously be longer than this already long video, but I hope that's okay with you all. Ranking the cups without doing the tracks first was a pretty fun challenge, so I can't wait to see how inconsistent I am with my own opinions once I can finally take the averages. But anyways, dry bones for Smash, and I'll see you guys next time.